So the three fellow panelists and the moderator will all. Okay. Well, oh, this is on. I'm live. Welcome, everybody. I know that we'll expect a few more people straggling in over the course of the afternoon, but I think we'll get started since we do have a tight schedule if we're going to fit everybody into this 2-hour block. Welcome on behalf of the Fox Center to the Fox Center's annual Undergraduate Honors Thesis presentations. As you know, I'm Carla Freeman. I'm the new director of the Fox Center. And I'm really delighted to take a moment to mark this celebratory occasion. And I see this as a celebration on 3 fronts. First, we're here to recognize and celebrate you, our illustrious undergraduate students, for your ambitious and creative scholarship. That's really the occasion. Secondly, I want us to recognize and thank all of the generous faculty who have been your mentors and advisors. This is really hard work, it's committed work, it's passionate work that your professors invest, not just in teaching you over your 4 years at Emory, but working closely with you on a thesis like this. And I think sometimes we don't take enough time to honor and thank the people who mentor and advise our students, so I want to do that right now. And finally, we're here to celebrate the breadth, creativity, and importance, really critical importance of the humanities themselves. I think we're living in a time when there is so much discussion about the doubt of the legitimacy and importance and value of the humanities, and I just couldn't be more delighted to celebrate your scholarship as illustration of just how much the humanities matter. Those in the audience, I also want to acknowledge our Fox Center staff, Colette Barlow and Keith Anthony, who have put this event together. They have supported and fed us over the course of this year, the semester that you've enjoyed. I want to thank the Fox Fellows, especially Laura Webb, who will be here shortly, Chris Spade, Michelle Taylor, and Haley Jones, who are going to be serving as the moderators for our undergraduate panelists. Most of all, I want to thank Shiv Sharma, who has been my most extraordinary TA. I don't think I've ever had a better TA. He's been my indispensable partner in really trying to help reconceive this program. It's still a work in progress to invest ourselves more thoroughly in the undergraduate experience. As some of you may have heard, we're kind of shifting to a full year model next year that'll start in the fall so that students feel more fully a part of the center and benefit from the mentorship and just vibrancy of the center itself. To the audience members, you are about to be treated to a range of theoretical traditions and disciplinary methods, from neuroscience and music composition to psychoanalysis, from ethnographic methods to literary and historical analyses. All of these projects several of these projects span vast geographic locations, from China to Strasbourg, Somalia to the United States. I couldn't be prouder and more excited by the scholarship that our students have presented. So very briefly, as you can see from your programs, the run of show is we have 4 separate panels, each of which has 3 students and a moderator. Each of the students has been given a very slim 5 minutes to present and distill down and present their thesis. Everyone in this room knows what a challenge that is. Every one of the professors who's worked with you knows that this is an almost impossible task. So we're all with you in the challenge of distilling probably more than a year of work into a 5-minute, greatest hits of your honors thesis. We're with you, we're behind you, and we also are going to keep to the 5-minute limit. So if you get this friendly wave from your moderator who's going to be sitting in the first seat, know that your time is going to be up. You've got 1 concluding minute to wrap everything up. At the conclusion of each of the 3 papers, we have 15 minutes for Q&A, which is a generous window. So anything that didn't get covered in those brief 5 minutes, we will be able to hear more about in the remaining Q&A session. So without further ado, panel number one. Oops. CG, I think I inadvertently got your, there we are.
All right, thank you, thank you. And thank you to everybody who's here online viewing this and who's here in person. Hello? Oh, okay, that's a lot, that's a lot better. All right, as I was saying, I'd like to extend thank you to everybody who's here in person and who's here online. And before I dive into the real meat and potatoes of my thesis, I would like to ask a preliminary question. Who here has ever felt chills when listening to music, with a show of hands? Yeah, for those of you online, almost everybody in here is raising their hand. So this is something that a lot of us are really familiar with, this experience. It's something I'm particularly familiar with. I had on Instagram, I had posted some stories of me watching some VHS tapes of myself with my family as a child. And the Instagram app had made a collage of these videos. And they had chosen the backing track to this collage as the intro to the second movement of Rachmaninoff's Second Piano Concerto. And for those of you who have not heard this piece before, it's one that's filled with a lot of nostalgia and sadness. And that was exactly what I felt when listening to this piece. And I knew that if these visuals were paired with something else, I definitely, like another piece of music, I definitely wouldn't have felt the exact same way. So that inspired the question within me, what is it specifically about the music? What are some of the compositional techniques in this piece that are causing me to feel these emotions? Now, with that in mind, I kind of dived into the current literature on the subject, looking at studies like Julia Merrill's, which was done in 2020, which found that when people listen to music and think about how the music makes them feel versus when people listen to music and think about how they feel themselves, they actually find higher changes of bodily levels with regards to like skin conductance and heart rate when they focus on the music itself. And it was concluded that, building on top of other studies that had shown that music is able to evoke similar sorts of physiological reactions that normal emotions would, that when people aren't really focusing on how they feel, it allows more space for their bodies to react naturally to the music. Or studies done by Coels et al. In 2013, which show that there is increased superficial amygdala activity when people listen to mostly Western classical music that has increased tension. Or studies like Salimpur et al. In 2011, which found that there are actually two distinct neural brain pathways that are activated that both use a mesolimbic dopamine system when people are anticipating chills in music and when people actually feel the chills in music. So these studies, including many more, are the ones that I used to kind of survey the land of what the current consensus was on a lot of aspects of music-evoked emotions. Now, all of these studies that I looked at, they use different pieces of music, mostly Western classical movie and video game music. So what I did is I then compiled a database of all of these pieces and I listened to them through the lens of a composer and kind of wanted to break them down into the three concepts of timbre, texture, and harmony. Timbre as in how the sounds are, like what do the sounds sound like, what's the quality of the sound, texture as in orchestration or who's playing what when, and harmony is how do all these sounds interact together. And with all of this in mind, I then turned this more of a literature review into a more practical aspect, composing a new four-movement string quartet titled Imolara, which is emotion or feeling in the Yoruba language. And I made this four-movement string quartet, with each movement intending to evoke a particular discrete emotion, with the first movement being Ayo for joy, the second movement being Ibinu for anger, the third movement being Ijaya for fear, and the last movement being Ibanuje for sadness. So with this in mind, I composed this piece, and I thankfully had some friends that were willing to play it, and the concert went very well. And I think it really, just shown by the audience reaction to the concert, I really feel like the intent of my project really came across with the audience, because the reason I make music is for people to hear it. So unfortunately, I do not have enough time. I would love to play clips from this, but there is a QR code there if anybody would like to hear the performance. Thank you very much.
I just have the one slide. It's just to entertain your eyes. I'm not going to be. Can you hear me better now? Not very good with the microphone. All right, so my name is Braden. My thesis, titled Kristeva and Loewald on Selfhood and the Potential Aptitudes of Parenthood, deploys psychoanalytic theory to re-evaluate the traditional formation of selfhood out of infancy and the intimate role of parental figures in that process. So how do we come to be our individual selves, the people that we become as adults? As Winnicott asks, is the child an individual yet? It's a seemingly basic question to which psychoanalysis has a complex, socio-politically significant answer. The story goes like this. As infants, we're born into the undifferentiated plenitude of the mother-infant dyad, wherein the infant takes the mother and itself to be one. In other words, at life's inception, as an infant, my mother is my entire world. But here's the deal. To discover one's individuality or to become a proper person in the world, psychical separation from that mother dyad is inevitable. However, the infant couldn't accomplish the psychical separation by itself. It requires the help of a parent to do so. This is what psychoanalytic theories refer to as the parental function. In the traditional theory, however, this function is divided across gendered characteristics. There is a maternal function, played by the actual mother or mother figure, such as the primary caregiver, or the person immediately and most consistently responsible for the infant's survival and growth, while the more nebulous paternal tends to name the responsibility to properly civilize or coach the infant. Often depicted as a hostile force, the father figure is whoever introduces the child to the ways of society or prohibitions of a civilization. In this story and in the move from maternal bliss to a paternal socialization, we find the infant devastated by the discovery of the world and the path to self-formation. This conflict between the child, the mother, and the father is narrativized through the plot of the Oedipus complex, something that most people see psychoanalysis as synonymous with. To make it as a person in society, the infant relinquishes or abandons a primordial intimacy to the mother, or identification with the maternal, and submits out of fear to the prohibitive authority of reality. That's the basic drama. And that's exactly where this account of self-formation becomes imbued with potential pitfalls for feminist politics. In my thesis, however, I discover the possibility within psychoanalytic theory to defy this model of subject formation. By way of the work of 20th century psychoanalysts Julia Kristeva and Hans Loewald, I identify a story of maturation with the character of fluidity, whereby the responsibility of a maternal and father figures needn't be antithetical, but rather work continuously and in harmony to prompt the infant's wish to discover and join the rest of the world. Rather than by way of hostility and paternality alone, the infant is prompted to identify with society primarily by the function to hold, and again, only later by an introduction of a third, a paternality that doesn't bear the necessary character of hostility. Thus, my project refuses the gender division in that traditional conception. My argument consists of 3 specific interventions. I observe that the maternal already shifts the infant toward the ways of the world and the life of sociality, in other words, socializes, and bears great cultural significance in such a way that makes plausible a parental continuity from maternal to paternal activity in the responsibility of socialization. I recognize that the traditional hostility of paternality isn't in any way necessary to the infant's identification with reality. I'm able to identify the infant's move toward identification purely by way of the want to do so. I contend also that in separation, identification with society proper doesn't entail a complete repudiation of primary identification with the mother. We necessarily carry forward into civilization rather than leave behind the existent authority of that maternal function. My tripartite intervention is meant to grant maternality beyond materiality, the complexity necessary to uphold a story of subjectivity characterized not by the maternal as merely the source of devastation and ultimately lack for the subject, but by the character of optimism, however ambivalent. In my intended liberation of the mother from representation as body or anti-sociality, I hope to highlight the perversity of a society fervently committed still to the subjugation of the maternal. And that is all.
Check. Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Yingyi. I'm a senior double majoring in economics and history. And Here's my honor thesis. Before I start my presentation, I like to introduce a story behind this Chinese silver coin here, which takes us back to time in February 22nd, 1784. So the ship depicted on this coin is called the Empress of China. And on that day, it set sail to Canton, a port city, China. In fact, it is also the first American vessel to set sail to the Far East since the US independence. And the most abundant cargo on board was quite strange by today's standard. It was a staggering 30 tons of American ginseng. And these ginseng made a sensation in China. It yielded more profits than other commodities combined. Fast forward to today, American ginseng is still a very prominent ingredient in both Chinese dishes and medicine. In fact, the bag of ginseng that labeled 100% American here on your right, it is one of the most popular souvenirs among Chinese tourists who travel to Wisconsin. So now you might wonder, why American ginseng? And my question is, why and how these American roots became such an integral part of Chinese culture? And my thesis, in order to answer this research question, unearthed the journey of American ginseng in the 18th and 19th century. And I trace its journey from its transformation from a American roots to a cornerstone of both the US economy and the Chinese cultural fabric. So to start with, the traditional historiography on the 18th and 19th century is very Eurocentric in nature, with Western European countries dictating at the emergence of a global economy. However, with American ginseng, we can see that although European countries like Britain and France, they initiated the exportation of American ginseng to China, we saw the United States swiftly taking the lead in this exportation. In fact, it was through exporting American ginseng and a lot of niche commodities like fur and sandalwood that the United States came to challenge the British hegemony in the Chinese market by the 19th century. And what's more fascinating is the role that the Chinese consumers played in this trade. So they dictated almost every aspect of this trade, from pricing and grading to the harvesting and preservation methods that Americans used in the United States. This forms a great contrast to the more well-known commodities of the time, such as tobacco, sugar, and coffee, and again complicates our understanding of this period and the power dynamic of this period. Moreover, I argued that the origin of American ginseng makes it a new point of inquiry into the early US-China relations. Chapter 3 of my thesis specifically explores why and how Chinese physicians assigned a specific medicinal quality to American ginseng, which is very vastly different from the Asian ginseng that the Chinese used to use. And I also explored the multifaceted reasons behind its usage, specific usage against opium addiction, a very acute societal problem to Qing China at that time. And I conclude that all of these local adaptations and implications reflects the evolving Chinese consumer taste and societal perception of the United States. So my thesis concludes that through this exploration of American ginseng's journey, we see a different narrative of global history. It is an unconventional story that we see commodities like American ginseng were commenced not by Western demand, but by Chinese taste. And where consumerism for exotics isn't just a Western phenomenon. Its journey compels us to re-examine global exchanges at that period, recognizing that the flow of trade not only flows from the west to the east to the west, but also from the west to the east. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Michelle Taylor. I'm a one-year postdoctoral fellow at the Fox, and I'm just here to moderate this excellent panel. So I'll just be calling questions for the next couple of minutes. Does anybody? Yeah?
I have a quick question for Yingyi. This project is super cool. I've heard about it a few times now. But a new question popped into my head this time. Yeah. Awesome. Okay, love. So I was wondering, because this root does seem to be, getting grown in America, and I guess specifically Wisconsin, which is funny. Is there like a recorded use of it by like indigenous American communities prior to it being traded to China? And I would wonder if like maybe some of that medicinal understanding was that information also transferred with its trade across the ocean?
That's a great question. So my research actually starts with this indigenous use of American ginseng, which lasted for at least a century before the European discovery of American ginseng. And they use it in a way similar to the Chinese. The Chinese use Asian ginseng, which is very fascinating. And then one of the person who actually discovered American ginseng used this to argue that the American continent and the Asian continent was in fact connected because of this connection. But it was only when American ginseng was transported to China that the Chinese physicians started to assign it with very specific qualities that were used to combat specific societal problems during that time. So I would say that this local adaptations and usage is a new point of inquiry for us to understand both the Chinese society at that time and also its connection with North America.
Thank you.
Thank you all for your lovely presentation. I had a question for Braden. I was really interested in, it seems like your thesis is kind of this answer to some of the ways that psychoanalytic theory about parent-child bonds are changing as parental gender roles also change. And I was curious if you could talk a little bit about how that applies to other like psychoanalytic theorists and how their sort of ideas about the ways that people are individuating in relation to their parents is changing as, we think about mothers and fathers' roles in new ways.
Thank you for your question, Ezra. It's an especially interesting one because I got asked a variation of it in my defense. And one of my committee members actually accused me of creating an implausible utopian story. And so I think you highlight something that I think I am also interested in highlighting, which is how because psychoanalytic theory tends to tell not a prescriptive but descriptive stories, as in trying to account for what it is that does occur. So I think as gender roles are eradicated, if such a thing is plausible, I think I am trying to tell a futuristic, forward-looking story of how subjectivity might actually emerge in a way that, for example, could potentially eradicate the need for the psychoanalytic clinic in general, which is also something I got accused of not taking into consideration, benevolently, of course, was asked kindly. But so something that I'm interested in is the way, for example, how Freud, creator of psychoanalysis, was had no choice but to take up the legacy or inherit what he was observing, the society that he was a part of. And so I think as hopefully we move beyond a binary that I find to be violent, which is something I attempt to bring up in the thesis as well. Sorry, I'm realizing I'm not actually sure if I've answered your question, but I do think that I am attempting to tell, I stand behind the utopia of what it is that I've written. I guess that's where I'll end it.
Michelle, medieval Michelle.
Those are both very fantastic questions. I would just say, with regards to the first one, I hate to say it, but it really is more of a result of convenience. A lot of studies have to do with Western classical music because of the US in particular does a lot of research about specifically music-evoked emotions. And there were some other studies that I observed. I forgot the exact title and date, but there was one that compared Western listeners with the Mofa tribe in Cameroon and compared original Western music and original Mofa music with spectrally manipulated versions that were really dissonant the entire time. And it showed that preliminarily, the Mofa tribe people were able to identify facial expressions. So that was something that was more or less culturally constant. But it also showed that both the Western listeners and the Mofa listeners had a preference for the consonant version of both the Western and the Mofa music, which kind of showed another sort of cultural consistency with regards to the dislike of dissonance. However, a more recent study done by Argstatter in 2015, which wanted to spread, I guess, to include more cultures, it included some European countries, then it included Korea and Indonesia. And they were looking at more discrete emotional categories like happiness, sadness, anger, disgust. But what they found is that across those groups, it was really only happiness and sadness that consistently was able to be identified. And a lot of the other emotions that had more cultural nuance to them were not really able, there were some things that were kind of lost in translation with regards to how they identified the music, which I find really interesting. And with regards to your second question, unfortunately, I did not do a lot of research specifically with how animals interact with music, but I have seen, as you have also, I've seen a lot of videos of animals interacting positively to music, but I've also seen some videos where animals will act rather apathetically towards music. So I definitely think that's a really interesting avenue of exploration in the future.
Thank you, everyone.
Hi, everybody. It's so nice to see you all today. My name is Zimra, and I'm a student here studying art history and nutrition science. And I'm very excited to speak to you today about my thesis research. I want to begin by asking you all to picture the last time that you ate pad thai. I would imagine it looked like maybe takeout containers on your living room floor or a nice little cozy restaurant. But now I want you to take that, and in the case of my thesis project, transport it into the space of a museum or a gallery. Today, I'm going to talk to you about reception history, archival research, and embodied experiences, approaches to food-based relational art. I've always been really deeply passionate about mediums of food and art, and thus this project kind of orients itself around the communal potentials of food-based relational artworks. In thinking about this potential of food and art, I found myself drawn to the work of Michael Rakowitz and Rikrit Tiravanija, as they both publicly produced food connected to their cultural identities and then shared for free in large quantities with their audience. My research engages mostly with Untitled Pad Thai by Tiravanija, which is shown on the left, as well as Enemy Kitchen by Michael Rakowitz. Untitled Pad Thai was first performed in 1990 as the artist set up a wok and prepared pad thai in the middle of the gallery space. This photo is from a 2023 recreation of the artwork at MoMA PS1. And then on the right, we have Enemy Kitchen by Rakowitz, which began in 2003 as Baghdadi Jewish cooking classes taught by the artist, and has since been transformed and reperformed as a food truck serving the food made from those same recipes. In pursuit of a well-rounded exploration into these two artworks, this thesis examined them and the distinct types of knowledge that may be gained from 3 different research methods, and how each responds to the problems posed to the art historian by these food-based participatory artworks that are essentially ephemeral and do not leave behind a solid art object for analysis. My first chapter outlined my exploration into these artworks through my reading of published textual accounts. I found that academic texts provided a lot of interesting grounding for questions on how identity and culture were attended to or not attended to in artistic critique and interpretation. And there was also a large quantity of text written for a lot more of a broad audience, for the general public, and that tended to rely on this narrative of artistic genius and there being like a singular creator of these artworks. What I find kind of lacking in those published accounts was also well supplemented by my research into archival records, which I touch on in my chapter 2. The archives placed much more emphasis on physical, culinary, and mental labor required to create these artworks. And while I did have some trouble accessing a huge breadth of information due to some constraints and limits within the archive, that fragmented information was still really critical to my own development and understanding around artistic labor in these artworks. These questions were only further emphasized for me in my in-person experiential learning around this art, and that was touched on in chapter 3. And through this direct engagement with Untitled Pai Tai, which again you can see on the left, I was able to more critically observe the possibilities and limits of relationship building in the space around this artwork, as well as the often unrecognized labor that goes into mass culinary production and just the cleanup of eating and sharing that large amount of food in a gallery space. So while in-depth analysis of those 3 methods were really critical to my paper, the reintegration of those 3 methods and what I learned from them led me to greater themes and questions that really were the crux of my research. And those questions were how artistic labor is perceived and what these artworks demand, as well as the ways in which cultural visibility is attended to or not in artistic institutions and published texts. And finally, the importance of expanding notions of community beyond just the unique artist-audience relationship. In thinking about labor, the temporal and spatial dimensions of culinary preparation and consumption create a very specific demand for this labor, and that transforms the way that one can read these artworks, potentially expanding notions of artistic community beyond just artists and audience to include this network of creators. The archive helps highlight this network, whether it's economic, legal, or physical labor. Finally, in terms of cultural visibility, in thinking around this artistic creation and the work of 2 diaspora-based artists, I really wanted to look at the way they created alternative sensory experiences with food and challenged the rarefied cultural space of the museum, incorporating this everyday act of eating and taking up also a lot of olfactory space in the museum. I could smell the waft of the food all the way from down the hall. And finally, in relationship power dynamics, that really helps ground my discussion of the first 2 themes, labor and cultural visibility. And while initial conceptualizations of relational aesthetics argue for a kind of utopian establishments of community between artist and audience, I hope to disrupt that framework and also incorporate potential relational tension, these ideas of labor, power imbalance, and the community needed to create such artworks. And I hope for those 3 themes to extend into the future research in the areas of food-based relational artworks. Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ezra, and I study anthropology and sustainability at Emory. And thanks for letting me talk a little bit about my thesis today, which is titled The Stories Behind Atlanta Food Growing, Oral History and Exhibition as a Research Method. So I started working at farmers markets in Atlanta in 2021. And something that I really noticed from this job is that most people don't have personal relationships with the food that they buy. And people that do have these relationships tend to invest in local foods so much more. So this realization, along with some of the research I was doing, investigating these really complex relationships between race, class, access to food, and urban agriculture in Atlanta, led me to conduct 8 oral history interviews, which are interviews where people narrate their life story as they choose and as they want. with 8 different urban farmers and local farmers market managers in Atlanta. So I wanted to start with a quote from one of these interviews with Abida Henderson, who is a food justice advocate and a community organizer in Atlanta. And she was talking in this quote about gentrification sort of keeping her from building a community garden in her neighborhood. She says, "I thought Westview was about to become like a utopia, where the elders and children could live there without being kicked down, and all the white folks and the black folks that had a different vision would just act like that was part of their vision too. But a real estate agent was over the code enforcement board for the community organization, like these folks knew what they were doing." So while these words are this really direct transcription of what Abida said, me reading them to you is a completely different experience than hearing Abida and watching her speak. And after I filmed these interviews, which were these really intimate and embodied accounts of why and how people grow food in Atlanta, I asked myself, how could I connect people with these stories experientially so that their meaning is more accurately conveyed? And how might this process strengthen relationships between people that are involved in our local food systems? So I tried to do this through 6 different multimedia artworks, which includes a digital archive, a short film, food demonstration, takeaway napkins, and I don't have time to talk about all of this today, but what I do want to do for this presentation, for the sake of time, is to talk about one of these projects, which was a collaborative quilt. So in February of this year, I hosted a sewing circle at Emory, where participants could watch clips from the oral history interviews from a digital archive that I created that was sorted according to 6 different themes in the interviews, which were early childhood food practices, identity, inequality and discrimination, food distribution and access, food and health, and future visions. And then after that, participants were encouraged to sew these patchwork designs into a quilt that were based off of narrators' experiences. So one participant, for example, made this cellular sort of wreath that was encasing her insulin pen. And she made this after watching a clip of Margaret Wilson talk about health disparities in Black and low-income communities that also have low access to fresh food. And it made her sort of reflect on her own biological necessities for fresh food. So then on March 20th, I hosted a community exhibition in Piedmont Park, where this quilt was all sort of sewn and patched together and then used as a tablecloth for exhibition visitors to eat on and to talk around. So sort of sewing circle participants, narrators, local food market managers were sort of invited to watch these clips and to eat food and sort of witness this collaborative art project. So in the end, I think this quilt was really a physical representation of these reflexive relationships between narrators' experiences, participants' experiences, and my own interpretation of the archive. And ultimately, the project brought in this new set of interlocutors that were then watching these interviews, interpreting and making meaning from them, and then connecting with other people about urban food growing. So through projects like these, my thesis really argues that using these collaborative and visual anthropological methods can create more diverse connections between project participants and interlocutors. It can increase people's personal investment in stories by creating these like embodied artworks or experiences. And it can also decenter the meaning making in anthropological research processes. So why is any of this important? I think, first of all, there's an important resource contribution here, as these 8 oral history interviews are going to be archived in the Rose Library and provide these intimate and more complete accounts, I think, of why and how people grow food in Atlanta. Secondly, I think that there's a methodological contribution of this project, as collaborative and visual anthropologists are really trying to find new ways to preserve the intimacy of traditional participant observation and ethnography, but in a way that offsets some of the time and money constraints of this, and also some of the unequal distributions of power. And finally, I think that there's a contribution to the local food network here by really strengthening relationships within food systems. And I think that this is really important in the context of responding to the climate crisis through collaboration and through care. A version of this project is also going to be featured in the upcoming Science Gallery exhibition called Resilient Earth. And I think that this will be a really exciting and new opportunity to sort of increase the community impact of sharing these stories.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Jacob Gibbs, and I'm a student in the Art History Department. And today I'll be talking about a work of art dubbed the William Rubin Coda and the African Art Auction Market, and what I deem is primitivism that's been reinvented in the 21st century. To begin, I'd like to take a journey back to the end of my first semester at Emory. After taking Dr. Lee's course of Contemporary Art of North America and Europe, I knew I wanted to pursue my studies in art history. I come from a medical family who's always emphasized the importance of research, but I didn't know what research in the humanities could look like. I took a chance and emailed Dr. Lee if she knew of any opportunities in the art history department, which is when she graciously referred me to Dr. Susan Gagliardi and now Dr. Haley Jones, who opened up my world to African art and the art auction market, which I had both been interested in at the time, but lacked the academic vocabulary and experience in both. I fell in love with African art because of the ways it could tell stories in ways that Western mediums could not. I also grew fascinated by the art auction market because of my background in economics and specifically my interest in value, selling African art. In my second semester at Emory, I began to explore valuation within the African art auction market alongside Dr. Jones, and I noticed that one work would sell for somewhere in the 10 millions, while another work would sell for somewhere in the 10,000s, when they appeared to be aesthetically and dimensionally very similar. Upon bringing this up to Haley, or now Dr. Jones, I learned that the highest valued works of African art were differentiated from other art, objects because of their purported relationship to some sort of modernist art movement or an art collector, or in the case of this work, an artist as well. In my pursuit of a senior thesis exploring this phenomenon, Dr. Gagliardi referred me to an object that has been dubbed the William Rubin Coda, as you can see on the left. This work of art sold for $6.1 million at a Christie's auction on June 23, 2015, in Paris. In the case of this sculpture, it sold for as much as it did because of all of the above: its relationship to a modernist art movement, an artist, and a prominent figure. In this case, analytical cubism, William Rubin, and Pablo Picasso. I sought to determine why this specific sculpture sold for $6.1 million when there are plenty of other works in what the auction market refers to as coda reliquary figures. In exploring the market's valuation, I also sought to disentangle the coda identity. What was coda? Who made this work? Was it even a reliquary figure? In my first chapter, I explored the coda identity further, only to walk away from my research with even more questions than when I had approached it. However, what I was able to discern was that the entire way with which art auctions and art historians view the coda identity is wrong. I'm less interested in arguing that this is some sort of arbitrary label given to a group of people, but rather that it's a fabricated aesthetic label that has been given to clumps of groups. And this is when I like to refer to this map right here. This is one of the first maps that comes up on Google search when you type in the coda people, but actually the coda communities of origin take up this entire region of Eastern Gabon, which just goes to show that the way that we view this identity in the first place and the aesthetic categories is incorrect in Eastern Gabon and Congo-Brazzaville. Though I was not able to access primary source documentation from communities of origin without conducting fieldwork in Eastern Gabon, I was able to pay close attention to the language of European ethnographers to determine where the current identifications of coda styles and subgroups came from. In aestheticizing the coda reliquary figure, these so-called art historians open up the door to market players to commodify these objects. In my third chapter, I explore William Rubin, who is the director of painting and sculpture at the Museum of Modern Art in New York City from 1973 to 1988. He curated a landmark exhibition titled Primitivism in 20th Century Art, Affinity of Tribal and the Modern. In my thesis, I argue that the William Rubin Coda's placement next to a Picasso drawing in this exact exhibition appreciated its value because it framed him as an emblem of primitivism, a narrative that implies that the sculpture influenced Cubism with little questions asked. In my chapter, I discuss how the exhibition went under fire. However, I realized when writing this thesis that to criticize the exhibition, discuss everything wrong with it, would be easy and uninteresting. This had been done before. The act of aimlessly criticizing is a cop-out. I had redefined my thesis to re-explore why this was so successful and why it's so heavily referenced to this day. I did not seek to tear apart William Rubin nor Christie's any longer, but rather understand why the success of this exhibition and the sale of this work of art could tell us about the market, the decontextualization of African art, the realm of primitivism, and the revisiting of narratives that we blindly trust without asking questions. Though I neglected to actually trace the precise origin of the sculpture and couldn't fully deconstruct the coda identity, I did successfully determine why this work sold for so much, and in doing so, we can learn more about the market. I suspect that this work sold for the amount that it did because of its aesthetic qualities and parallel to Cubism, its perceived rarity, its provenance, who's owned the work, and its placement next to the iconic and controversial 1984 exhibition next to a Picasso. Each of these factors contributed to the sculpture's record-breaking sale. They can't be separated from one another, but rather worked in tandem to sell for $6.1 million. The African art market is growing very quickly. When I began this project, it was the third highest valued work of African art. Now it's the 10th highest valued work of African art. I believe that in telling these stories, they would even more properly, they would sell for even more. But is this even a good thing? It irked me that market players were profiting off of these objects when they played no role in their creation, but rather their marketing and decontextualized framing. In not knowing where these objects came from, it opens an entire door of questions regarding, was it ethically acquired? Probably not. Was it commissioned? We don't know. Should it be returned to Gabon? In this case, to who? These questions were at the forefront of my curiosities that I asked myself when I took a moment to zoom out of the market. I really have grown to love this sculpture, but often questioned the entire approach of selling art that somebody else made and profiting off of it. Thank you.
Hello. So that was our amazing second panel on arts and communities. I'm Haley Jones. I'm a dissertation completion fellow at the Fox Center. And I think we have a great theme between these three presentations, some surprising intersections between themes of art reception, how art is received and understood by the communities who perceive them, the role of artwork in learning and understanding the world around us. And so I welcome any questions for our panelists. Yes.
I have one for Zimra. This may be a very naive question, but I'm just curious about how you're distinguishing between labor in a restaurant and art labor in the installation that you're talking about.
That's a great question, and I've been asked that many times. It's a super valid question, and one that I think a lot of people have toiled over. I noticed a tendency in a lot of writing about these artworks to avoid any description of the taste or smell of the food. And I think that in and of itself is kind of this attempt to differentiate the role of the food in an artistic setting versus the role of food in a restaurant, where, you know, a restaurant review is all about the taste and smell of the food. And I would say that a lot of the labor looks very similar. The student performers who were re-performing the artwork clearly maybe hadn't worked in restaurants because there wasn't a lot of like sanitization to be made aware of. So there was, again, that distinction too of like, it is a different legal framework to be working within. And also people entering the space set very different expectations for themselves when you're being given free food in a museum setting. But obviously just beyond the museum telling you it's an artwork, I would say that an emphasis on the relationships built around the food is often the argument as to why it is an artwork. And that the focus of the art is actually not on the dish at all. I mean, Rickert says, I'm not a chef every time he's asked. So the focus is on something a little bit more expanded from the food. And I would say that's the frequent argument.
Yes.
Thank you. These are all wonderful. I have a question for Ezra. It was such a fantastic project, and I love the methodology. And if I could zero in on the visual anthropology part, it's just really admirable that you've already got these stories in, or will soon be in the Rose Library, et cetera. I was wondering in terms of form of visual anthropology. So there's been a lot of experimentation, of course, not just with kind of film, but montage, for example, and I was thinking of montage in relation to the quilt. And I guess my question is maybe future oriented with for your own work and ideas looking ahead. Are you going to pursue visual anthropology, and what kinds of experimentation away from film as documentation have you thought about and might you pursue? So thank you very much for your project and look forward to your answer.
Oh, what a great question. Yeah, I think that you're right that there's sort of this move in visual anthropology right now away from ethnographic filmmaking. I think it's been sort of the main mode of visual anthropology for a long time. And I think I felt very drawn to doing these forms of like soft sculptural works with like community quilt circles and I didn't mention it in my presentation, but I also made these embroidered takeaway napkins for people to sort of eat with and then take home after the exhibition. And I think one reason that I'm really drawn to these sort of collaborative, soft sculptural works as a form of visual anthropology is because they're such, historically collaborative processes. Like sewing circles have been an important part of, women bonding, especially Black women in the United States for a very long time. And we're often sort of meant to address social problems and social causes. So I think that there's a unique sort of opportunity in sewing, montaging, quilting, stuff like this, not only to represent anthropological research in sort of this intimate and personal way, but also to bring other collaborators into these projects in this artistic practice that's like pretty accessible. Learning how to sew, I think, it's a fairly accessible artistic task. So I am interested in pursuing visual anthropology in the future, certainly in an applied context, I think. And I think that there's so much more to do, scale-wise and in, community impact, community workshops, stuff like that with soft sculptural projects.
Yes, question over. Oh.
Hey, Jacob. I really liked your presentation on valuation of art. And I think what is kind of driving this question is your framework for the disparity in different artworks and kind of analyzing the things that make something more valuable than the other. Do you think that could be abstracted for other mediums of art or beyond just the African art market?
Okay, so yeah, I appreciate that question. So something that I really explored toward the end was the fact that the African art market really started in Paris in the early 20th century, and certain collectors were establishing a kind of aesthetic criteria for this. And this has just been, I would say, blown out of proportion, and that criteria still stands today. And that's just been used over and over again. And I think to answer your question, I think that can be applied to a lot of other markets outside of art, outside of African art, in the case that when valuation was first being created and a criteria was first being established, even though we've grown away from so much from the time that's been established, there's still not even remnants, but the foundation of that hasn't changed. For example, the sharp geometric features, that was because collectors wanted that, 100 years ago. That never changed. That's still what people are looking for now. So even that's why I made the point that all of the factors that led to its high valuation can't be separated from each other, because even though, yes, its owners played a big role, the reason it had those owners was because of these features. So yeah.
Any final questions? No? Oh, yes.
I just have a question for Jacob too. I'm really, all 6 presentations were amazing. The research is incredible. Jacob, my question to you is just how you researched your topic, because I'm really curious as far, did you look at archives? Did you did you look at newspapers? I'm just curious as far as how you found the information that you were looking for. You had real specific questions.
Yeah, I really appreciate that question, because that's especially what Haley guided me in starting my first year. A big resource I used is a database called Arcade, and that has access to all art auctions. I don't want to give a date arbitrarily, but for a very, very long time. And that's what, and her research is narrowed from 2000 to 2020. So when I was comparing this work to other works, I was able to put in filters of, coda, for example, as a style, or these dates. And that was a big one. Another really helpful archival resource was accessing old auction catalogs, which I accessed through the Emory library and got in the span of 4 or 5 days, which is very helpful. And that's how I was able to compare the works to the other works sold at the auction and really look at the valuation of works. Because this was shown at 3 different auctions, and I had to order all those to compare them.
All right. I think that's all the questions for this panel. Thank you very much.
All right, hello everyone. My name is Harrison, and my honors thesis project is titled Crossing Confessional Borders, Poor Relief and Migration in Reformation Strasbourg. Through this research and during this presentation, there's two questions in particular I'm looking to answer here. First is, why is Strasbourg in the 16th century far more inclusive and tolerant of foreign migrants than a lot of other early modern cities? And then the second one is, how are these migrants coming into the city influencing the social welfare reforms happening at the time? So the title of the project was Crossing Confessional Borders. I want to talk a little bit about what I'm referring to specifically with borders. I think typically a lot of our connotation with this type of language is around the modern nation state. But in the 16th century, we're very much in the foothills of the development of the modern nation state. Germany, where Strasbourg is located, is very kind of decentralized and fragmentary. So what are kind of other ways we can think about borders? And I think fundamentally what they are boundaries between social groups, and how are social groups constructed along cultural lines, linguistic lines, and what I think is particularly pertinent in the Reformation are confessional borders and boundaries. Confession here is referring to the denominations of Christianity that arise during the Reformation. The main three are Lutherans, Calvinists, and Catholics. So this conception of borders is not purely focused on physical demarcations, but also kind of imagined boundaries, or it's kind of the boundaries between imagined communities. So what do I mean by referring to 16th century Strasbourg as a borderland? On this map here, we can see the red line is the border with France, and the black dot is Strasbourg. It's quite a bit away from the French border. It's not right on the border until the 17th century. But this map shows the confessional geography of early modern Europe. And if we look, Strasbourg kind of finds itself right at the juncture of all the major confessional groups. We have Lutherans, which are the purple to the north and to the east. Calvinists are the turquoise blue, so that's right to the south and along the Rhine. And then Catholics to the west, which is the green and the yellow. And so being kind of in this geographical position, the city becomes very sort of confessionally fluid. It can't kind of be pinned down in one of these broad confessional categories. And also what happens is you get a lot of cultural diversity. So you have migrants coming from Germany, France, Switzerland, England, the Dutch Republic, just to name a few examples. So we have that idea of borders laid out. So now I'm going to turn to migration and then kind of tie that in. So it's the 16th century, and with the onset of the Reformation, it becomes a period of very great migration because with this diversification of Christianity and more broadly religion, church authorities have a new drive to keep their communities religiously homogenous and therefore purge their communities of religious dissent. And so many people are getting displaced either by expulsions or persecution. So it becomes a very mobile society. And so when these migrants are arriving to another early modern city, having been displaced, they're often weary from travel, poor, dispossessed of any of their possessions. And so it presents the city with a dilemma because often they're trying to access the welfare resources of the city. So it presents the city with a dilemma in that they can either take in these migrants and offer them welfare resources, which places a financial and bureaucratic burden on the city, or they can do what a lot of early modern cities did and either just bar them from access or expel them again. And a lot of neighboring German cities like Ulm and Frankfurt did this. So it's unusual that Strasbourg is doing the opposite and that they're taking in a lot of these foreign migrants from diverse cultural and confessional backgrounds and offering them welfare resources. So to return to the questions I posed at the beginning, what my research found was because with Strasbourg being this borderland with high confessional and cultural fluidity, their boundaries of community are much more porous and kind of fluid than a lot of other early modern cities, and this predisposes them more to being more inclusive and more charitable towards foreign migrants of diverse backgrounds. And so what happens is with these migrants coming in, the current welfare infrastructure in place is often not great enough to accommodate this volume of people. And so the bureaucratic apparatus has to be continually expanded. And this is what's happening in the 16th century as more and more migrants are coming in. And so what we're really seeing is through migration, we're seeing the development of a state-run, robust welfare institution. And the last thing I'll say is thinking about borders and borderlands history in the Reformation has not typically been a common tactic of scholars. So my research is also trying to provide a new interpretive tool for further research. Thank you.
All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Mari Ismail, current senior majoring in religion and minoring in Italian. Before I go into my thesis, just gonna let you guys know that my thesis actually started a few years before now. When I first visited Somalia in 2016 with my family, I immediately noticed how different the culture was from what I had in the United States. I had to wear long sleeve shirts, long dresses, long skirts, wear a hijab, and I could never go out by myself. I'd either have to be accompanied by my younger brother or a male family member, even if it was to go to the corner store. And I was very confused on this reality and definitely realized that it was different from how I grew up. I was also further confused because the Somalia that my mother described seemed very different from what I witnessed. My mother talked about having co-ed classrooms and going to the beach with her girlfriends and not wearing a hijab and having a school uniform that included shorts. So I was very confused and obviously knew that there was some transformation that had occurred in just her lifetime. So my thesis, which I now have looked into, answers the following questions of what caused the social transformation of Somalia before being a more social liberal hub to a culture and society influenced by extremist Islamic ideology. Furthermore, what caused it to happen in such a short period of time, within 40 years. This thesis also looks into women specifically as bearers of culture and how they have been a tool of preserving and reshaping culture, specifically in the Somali context. So essentially my thesis is in 3 parts, with the first part looking at Somalia before European colonialization, during, and then right after. And essentially right after European colonialism in Somali society, there was influence within traditional Somali religions such as Waqism and Judeo-Christian influences. Overall, Somali society was pretty Islamic, but it had lots of socialist ideas and more liberal ideas. And this was due to the president at the time, President Siad Barre, and his connections to the Soviet Union and his implementation on pushing out socialist ideas to make Somalia more modern and Western. The second part of this thesis looks at what led to the war to occur. And essentially, with President Siad Barre's administration, they started to become more and more nepotistic and basically started favoring certain tribes over others. And this created marginalization of certain tribes and groups. And this conflict eventually led to the Isaq genocide, as you can see in the middle top row. And with the Isaq genocide, the Isaq and other marginalized tribes came together and basically ousted Siad Barre and his administration, creating a power vacuum and basically starting the Somali Civil War. The third part of my thesis looks at the aftermath of the onset of the Somali Civil War. The Civil War is still considered ongoing today, but definitely to a different varying degree than it did originally when it began. And the thesis further looks at specifically Somalis in the diaspora, as there are currently 2 million people, including me and my family, that are a part of this diaspora, and how specific individuals, especially Somali women, have come up in their communities and societies to ensure that the Somali culture and legacy and traditions are kept and preserved and also understood in these new host countries. My thesis and research to me is a more personal exploration to learn more about my background, my foremothers, and why my realities today are different from my mother's and also different from my grandmother's. However, in an academic sense, I think this work is very important because Somalia as a culture, as a nation, isn't discussed much academically outside of the Civil War and the concept of being a failed state. And so I want my work to be a different dimension of that, highlighting the beauty of the culture and of the diaspora. Furthermore, what occurred in Somalia is unfortunately not unique. There are many, many communities around the world that have experienced power vacuums occurring and instability and cultural shifts occurring within the culture. And so with the Somali framework, that can be used to analyze these other analogous communities and to understand why these shifts have occurred. Thank you.
I didn't realize I put a fade on that title card. Hi, I'm Matthew Crosswhite. For the time being, I'm a senior in history, and I did an honors thesis with Dr. Melinda Maynor-Lowry on Native education in this country and how it's always existed as a form of to incite culture shift. The thesis has undergone a lot of changes since the last time I presented this at the Fox Center, so I hope it's fresh and new for everyone who's heard it before. In 2022, the United States Department of the Interior published a report concerning federal Indian boarding schools in the 20th century, arguing that the entire crux of these schools was to force onto Native students a course of education meant to entice students to reject their Native ways of being, customary practices, and significantly their own languages. The interest of this education was to entice future land concessions to the United States. However, my thesis argues that the practice of Native education in being coercive education didn't begin in the 1800s with these boarding schools. Rather, it's been the focal point of Native education since its foundation at Harvard with the Harvard Indian College in 1650, and even before that in 1636 with the foundation of Harvard itself. There's 3 chapters. The first one looks at Harvard in the 1600s, 17th century, specifically the Harvard Indian College. The second chapter concerns Moore's Indian Charity School, which is the precursor to Dartmouth College in the 1700s, and then Tunasasa Boarding School, which is a sister school to Haverford in the Tri-College Consortium in the 1800s. The thesis follows a tripartite construction to look at the 3 significant eras of Native education in the country. What emerged out of a historiographical period in Native history in the 1990s called the New Indian History were terms to describe the eras of pre-modern Native education, of the colonial, federal, and era of self-determination. And each chapter looks at a specific a college emblematic of those periods in their times. So to begin, the Harvard Indian College was a college founded by John Eliot that existed to first and foremost locate Native students with proficiencies in Native languages, particularly Wampanoag, to lend those proficiencies in the creation of Native language texts and grammatical guides for English missionaries to enter into Native communities with those texts and introduce Christianity and European legal practices that would incite culture change. However, that wasn't the main goal of Harvard, to do that post-life of the texts. It was the production of the texts themselves. Native language in the space of the Harvard Indian College was such that Native people were expected to share and maintain their proficiencies and give them to their English peers, while also learning European languages to translate these texts. Following in the next era, is the 1700s. Crucially, between the decline of the Harvard Indian College in the 1670s and the rise of the Moore's Indian Charity School, King Philip's War happens in New England, which is a conflict fought between Metacomet, a Wampanoag Sachem, and the United States over frequent English incursions into specified Native lands. The result of this War and Native peoples' defeat is a constraining of Native sovereignty, a frequent disrespect to treaties and land boundaries. This is reflected in the Indian Charity School, which decided to reject Eliot's model and instead focus on giving, thank you, English educations to Native students to themselves become missionaries, while teaching them that their languages themselves were inferior and to spread English to people, while simultaneously and ironically being expected to teach their languages to their teachers. The third and final chapter is Tunsasa. So in 1830, the United States passes the Indian Removal Act, which says whole-scale, all Native nations, unless otherwise specified, particularly in New England, east of the Mississippi, must be removed to the west. Later still, in 1887, the Dawes Act is passed, which seeks to break down Native tribal towns into allotments and force Native people into European labor practices and gendered constructions. And that's reflected in Tunsasa. Tunsasa education itself targets Native understandings of life through language. There's no more room for Native language. As well, the education they receive targets parts of their ways of being. In addition to religion and English, they learn botany to be taught, thank you, their understandings of the world are inferior to United Statesians who wanted to, again, coerce that land concession. Thank you.
Thanks very much to all of our speakers. I am Laura Webb. I am a postdoctoral fellow at the Fox Center this year, and it is my pleasure to moderate this panel on histories and identities. I think we have 3 really rich projects to talk about, all dealing with borders and identity creation. So I'll open up the floor for questions and conversation. Yeah. Oh, yes. Oh, is there a mic? I don't know. You know better than I do. You can always come up here.
I have a question for Harrison. So during your presentation, you mentioned a diversity within groups defined as poor when you were talking about the changes that were being made in aid systems. And I was just wondering if during your research, you encountered any discrepancy in the kinds of aid that were provided to these subgroups, let's say within the poor, and whether that has anything to do with their perceived otherness. If you could say a little bit more about that.
Wait till it goes green.
Hello. Okay. Yeah, it's a great question, and right, it's not always the welfare schemes that are put in place are not always a blanket fix, right? So in the early Reformation around the 1520s and 1530s, they tend to have less kind of barriers to entry. Later on, there start to be restrictions put in place, particularly on able-bodied men. Later on, they typically are no longer, even if they're foreign and poor, they're typically no longer eligible to receive aid from civic funds. So that would be one big restriction. As far as along a kind of confessional or cultural lines, culturally, not that I know of. Confessionally, at a certain point, yes. In the 1650s, Catholics would no longer be eligible, but that's quite a bit later on. And some of the more radical kind of groups like Anabaptists after around the 1530s are no longer eligible too. But along cultural and linguistic lines, not that I know of.
Hi, thank you for those talks. I have a question for Mari. I wonder, you offered a tantalizing phrase about women as bearers of history, something like that, and I would love to hear you elaborate on that because it was such a powerful idea.
Yeah, I mean, when I wanted to really map out this cultural transformation, I mean, I noticed it immediately with my own expectations when I went to Somalia compared to my younger brother. And I noticed that most evident with my mother's stories, and then when looking into research, what women could do versus what they could do now. In my thesis, I talk about like jazz clubs and women and men, no matter the faith, intermingling and enjoying those scenes with no restrictions on anyone. With dress, with my thesis, I have photos of women, and you can see in their attire how different it was and the expectations today. And also women having the ability to hold positions and not just lower level positions, but they were in government, they were in Siad Barre's administration. And so it was the most evident with women seeing this cultural change. And within that, it just made it so much easier to focus on women within this thesis, because I just saw the most change within them. And thinking about how I was raised and how the Somali community is structured, family structures, it's usually the women dominating everything. My mother's the head of household. She is their mother and father. And all that I know from my culture has been mostly through the women. And it just became evident to me that culture is through women. And my research really supported that, and the evidence that I found supported that. Yeah, thank you.
I guess if there are no other pressing questions, I have like much more of a reflective question for all three of you. If you could share more about your process of doing this work, research, which is to do with like the relation between history and the present, especially when you're looking back at such vast sort of expanses of time. What kind of attunement do you have to bring to your own objects of research? Are you using categories that mean differently across time periods? Because again, for you, Harrison, again, you were speaking about the idea of borderlands, which maybe is conceptualized differently in your research, whereas in the present, it might have a different ring to it within the conception of the nation state itself as the main arbiter of communities. But same for you, again, Mari, in terms of again, what is the notion of modernity, empowerment, and all of these questions that we bring to bear upon the reading of history itself. But I'm just curious, for all three of you, how did you interact with the archive? What is that? How do you deal with the questions of the present as bearing upon your reading of history?
Start and then pass it down. So for me, immediately when starting my research, I realized that I just struggled finding textual sources and documents, partly because of war and items being destroyed, and then partly because of the Somali culture itself being such an oral culture, such an oral tradition. This has been like my recent fun fact, but the Somali language wasn't written in script until 1972. So my research begins before that, the time period I'm looking at. And so a lot of my work has been dependent on oral narratives. And within my thesis, I have 3 oral interviews that I conducted after each chapter, where it's an individual that has gone through the Somali Civil War, have experienced it, but they each have very different perspectives in their role on what side they were on and what they experienced, and then how they became part of the diaspora. And so a lot of the work and the conclusions that I've come to have been really influenced and adapted by these personal connections and narratives, which for me, on a personal sense, connected me even more to my culture, and for an academic sense, really enriched the current discourse of Somalia, which really just focuses on one specific event that occurred.
In NACI archives are like your best friend and your enemy. The most popular myth is that there are no native sources in archives, and it's a popular myth because it's easy to believe, but it's also entirely false. I was very lucky for my first 2 chapters to be Harvard and Dartmouth, because those are 2 of the most researched colleges for anything you could do. It's the first and last pre-colonial colleges, oh my God. But for my third one, Tunasasa, there was only one piece of like secondary literature on that school by Paula Palmer, who says there are no native sources surviving Tunasasa. That was told to me the moment I got at the Haverford archives as well over last summer. And then I spent 2 weeks in the archives and I found 4 papers by native students. So the relationship with the archive is one that I've encountered in my prior digital humanities work with Dr. Michael Mortimer, that archives privilege narratives and undervalue others and create these silences. And what I found in my second chapter, because all my chapters are based around Native students, there was only one piece of anything written by Aaron Occam, my subject of my second chapter, and instead it was a lot of things written about him by his English peers and teachers. So instead of reading what they were saying about him, I was reading what he was doing and thinking about how that relates to his father, one of the most famous Native ministers in the entire course of American history, Samson Occam. And then for chapter 3 as well, it undergirds it, it reinforces the point that the point of American colleges is to reproduce Eurocentrism. That in silencing Native students to a degree that you have 100 years of history at Tunisasa and only 4 papers survive, why are those 4 being preserved? It's because those are the 4 talking about Christendom and temperance and things that the Quakers valued, and that itself brought a critique to my thesis.
Yeah, so I can talk a little bit about the archives I use too. So a lot of the southern German cities that have been very heavily studied typically are that way because they have much more extensive archival records than some smaller cities, and Strasbourg would be one of those. There is an archive there called the Hospital Archive, and this is not hospital in the sense of the modern term of purely healthcare, but kind of coming from the same etymology as hospitality, or of just places to stay. And it is quite meticulously recorded. There are, especially for these large waves of migrants, it's sometimes difficult to locate them in the sources. I'll give you an example. For instance, from about 1530 to about 1551, there's actually a record of foreign migrants coming in and being given charitable resources, and then after that, they kind of stop recording it as kind of meticulously and explicitly, so then you kind of have to start kind of putting the pieces together and kind of speculating at certain points. For example, one kind of barometer you can use is, which groups are eligible for citizenship at certain times, and that's usually a kind of a good telltale of when they can access welfare resources. So there is some of that piecing together. As far as the point about kind of it speaking to our more present world, I think the issue with the question of borders, thinking of this more as also an imagined boundary between social groups is kind of a new phenomenon as well. And thinkers in the Enlightenment, a lot of them thought that borders simply fell along natural kind of geographic structures like rivers or mountain ranges or something like that. And we know now that that's not really the case. And I think a lot of borderland scholarship is arguing that really the imagined boundary forms and then the physical demarcation forms after that kind of as a result. And so I think that's where it kind of comes into play, even if it's not the national borders that we think of today.
We have time for one very short question. Very quick one. All right. Well, I will keep on task then and say thank you once again to our wonderful speakers for this panel. These all work together so nicely. Thank you so much.
Okay, can everyone hear me okay? That's great. No technical difficulties in a project about technology. As you might have guessed, that's the question that dominates my research. How is it that are there dominant groups who can use technology to establish order? And counter to that, are there marginalized people? Is there the possibility to appropriate these devices and use them to put up meaningful resistance? So I'm exploring this question in literature primarily because I'm an English major, but also I'm a person with a smartphone. And sometimes you'll read things that governments and corporations are up to, and you'll say, oh my God, that is a nakedly dystopian thing to happen. And where does that come from, our idea of dystopia? I mean, it's obviously shaped by a larger science fictional tradition. And so the text that I'm looking at, Manjula Padmanabhan's Harvest, and a short story by Vandana Singh. If you get the chance to read them, I recommend it. They are fascinatingly violent and extremely interesting. But they're concerned with this trend in Western science fiction where technology tends to be depersonalized, in the sense that it's made a future problem something to worry about only when it becomes sentient and when it's not being controlled by somebody in charge. And so a response among Indian science fiction writers has been to question this relationship and remind us that technology is very much a problem in the present also. There are people in charge right now who are using technology against people, and that raises a whole other ongoing scholarly debate that I am a part of, which is who's using technology, who are they using it on, and who doesn't get access to development, distribution, and the use of technology. And so one of the things that I like about my texts is that, frustrating as they are, they do give a kind of response to this problem of depersonalization, which is interestingly named the domestication of technology. And what this means is appropriating machines that you might not have control over otherwise to make them fit your context, fit your needs, not to escape an exploitative situation or withdraw from it, because those strategies come with problems for the marginalized subject who is trapped by that system and forced to participate, but instead to kind of rewrite the situation and make it livable, which I think is much more practical for the everyday reader. And so the strategy that I mobilized to read this domestication is called Jugaad. And the Hindi speakers in this room will recognize that it translates roughly to making do. And what that involves is just mobilizing whatever resources you have at your disposal to come up with a solution that works for the time being. And this, for me, was a very accessible and fundamentally connective strategy, because it doesn't require, by definition, anything more than what you already have. And so the conclusions that I can draw from these texts is a change in the way that Indian science fiction is going now, because it refutes conventional ideas of power to argue to the reader, who is also implicated in these systems of domination, that just because you don't have institutional power doesn't mean that you are not powerless.
Hello, everyone. My name is Chase Wolfson, and my honors thesis is in the field of creative writing, but it interplays as well with topics and themes of religiosity, belief, and theology. At the beginning of my writing process, I sought to examine two primary research questions. The first being, what constitutes the religious? And the second, how do religious forms operate when facing the inexplicable? In the religious scholarly community, there is not a singular agreed upon definition of religion. Some people gravitate more to Emile Durkheim's ideas of the sociological aspects of religion, the unification of the individuals, the set-apart nature of places, rituals, and objects. However, others gravitate more to Rudolf Otto's idea of the numinous, or the self-experience with the divine. My research project, which is constituted of 5 interconnected short stories, follows the lives of 6 individuals after a ball of light appears in their small-town grocery store. Each character is forced to contend with making sense of the inexplicable, using their personal history, their familial background, and the religions that they come from, as well as their identities. Each character, as they try to understand what this ball of light is, also must re-examine their relationship with the divine, their community, and ultimately themselves. From the outset of my writing, there's this quote that I found really powerful that stuck with me. It's from Joan Didion's The White Album. She opens with this line, "We tell ourselves stories in order to live." We live entirely, especially if we are writers, by the imposition of a narrative line upon disparate images, by the ideas with which we have learned to freeze the shifting phantasmagoria, which is our actual experience, or at least we do for a while. Now, this quote had 2 implications in my writing process. Primarily, as a writer myself, I had to examine the stories that I was telling to make sense of the amalgamation of academic and personal ideas that I've researched over the last year and a half, but also throughout my entire life. However, it also had implications for my characters, as they too were telling stories to make sense of the world around them and decipher this supposedly supernatural event. At the end of my writing, I came to 3 conclusions based on my initial 2 research questions. The first was that human beings are drawn to the religious, whether or not that's found in an institutionalized or organized religion. This means that people are often drawn to the rituals such as prayer, communion, or community building that religions offer, but they can find those things outside of a church, synagogue, mosque, or temple. The second conclusion that I drew was that we can often get stuck in a self-confirmation cycle of belief, where the things we think are true about the world are the things that we believe in. And in this, we can surround ourselves with ideas and people who don't often offer opposing ideas or critical thoughts. However, my third finding was that with enough courage or critical thinking or discomfort with where one is, we can break free of that cycle of self-confirmation. We can learn to unfreeze the shifting phantasmagoria, as Joan Didion says, parse through and find what is ourselves and what is something bigger. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Solomon Kim, and I'm a 4th year studying music composition and economics. And I want to start off by telling you about a quote from Peter Gelb, who's the current director of the Metropolitan Opera in New York City, which is, I believe, the largest and the oldest opera company in the United States. He said in a recent interview last year that the Met was going to pull money from their endowment to commission new works. Great. But what he said is that they're going to focus on commissioning the right kind of contemporary music. And I want to pause and consider the chilling implications of there being a right or wrong kind of art that should or should not be supported by our leading cultural institutions. And zooming out from that, I want to consider, and what this thesis does consider is the really complicated, really entangled web of incentives and of pressures that begin when we mix art as a form of expression and art as a form of economic production. Starting with Attali's conception of contemporary music as repetition and adding Adorno's idea of commodification, I became interested in the response of the contemporary artist to commodification. Some choose to optimize for commercial success. Some choose not to. But are there people and are there spaces for individual and collective expression beyond the limits imposed by these economic, social, political, or intellectual boundaries? This thesis was a compilation of 7 compositions and improvisations, all of which sought to deal with that issue or that concern in some way or in some respect. I used both my musical expressions and musical expressions of collaborators such as the Atlanta Improvisers Chorus, a local contemporary music group, to intentionally use both notated and improvised music to open space for constructions of futures that can be more oriented towards community rather than commodity in artistic creation. I used an intentionally transidiomatic approach rather than one oriented towards marketability or commercial appeal in order to explore the potentialities that are unlocked when artists create without regard for commercial success. And I think most importantly, through this work, I personally considered this question for myself, this question of what to do in the face of the commodification of one's art. And I decided to reject the premise. I decided to flood the market with my creations, and this is a bit of an economic pun from my second major, but to flood the market means to intentionally open the floodgates and just dump so much into the market that the value goes down to near zero. By doing this with my art, I'm intentionally opting out of that question of support, of the financial viability of my strange contemporary music. And I'm opening the door to creating in community with artistic collaborators and to bringing people in rather than trying to optimize my way towards commercial success. In terms of the relevance to this wider field, something that I think is increasingly common in the arts today is trying to prove our viability and trying to prove that we have a return on investment. There's a quantification and there's a kind of pre-professionalization of arts education. Particularly at Emory, although we have a wide-ranging support for the arts, I think there is still always this mindset that things come back to the career. And I think that all artists need to consider this question of commodification and of how they relate to between their art, themselves, and money. And my hope is that this thesis can serve as an example of a reflective process through which people can arrive at their own individual conclusions. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Chris Spade, and I'm the postdoc in poetry here at the Fox. That was a great panel. Now that they're all over, I think one of the best panels. Am I right? If you have questions, please ask them. And if we run out, then maybe I'll ask some questions. Yeah, we got one over here.
Chase, I really adore your thesis a lot. And the significance of the number 7 is not lost on me. But what was it like? What did you have to do to get yourself to a headspace of someone who might not have had like a religious or personal background that you don't also have?
Yeah, that definitely is a hard thing to do, to step outside yourself. I think primarily what I attempted to do was write things that I disagreed with and try to agree with them, even though I knew like personally I might not follow that path. I think there are hints of myself in all of my characters, but I also think there are things that I would definitely never do. My protagonist in my first story is kind of a religious zealot, and he uses religion to kind of justify all these negative things that he does, like cheat on his wife. And obviously I don't agree with that, but trying to step inside of his head and find his motivators and the things that he cared about. So yeah, definitely not an easy process, but I think it takes a lot of knowing about other people and knowing different people who you disagree with and learning to talk to them as inspiration and use them as inspiration for your characters.
Question back there, and then Haley.
Thank you so much. Solomon, I have a question for you. So I'm very moved and deeply sympathetic to your project, but also as a scholar of contemporary art, I can see that like the late 20th century is littered with projects by artists who are trying to circumvent the art market, right? And trying to create structures of, if not flooding, at least creating multiples, right? Multiples being a mechanism by which you produce many copies or iterations of something, so that you don't have the privileged object as the commodity or the rarefied or erratic work of art. And I wonder to what extent you've thought about failure, the failure of the historical failure of such utopian projects. Or is it something that you won't entertain because you can't, right?
Well, you asked the question, so I will entertain it. But I think that especially with the advent of the internet, I think the music industry has also seen kind of similar utopian attempts to like democratize distribution or access. Something like SoundCloud, where anyone can make an account and upload their music. And I do also see failure in many of those models because it always comes back to buying and selling. I think that you are probably right in that it's an extremely utopian pursuit. However, part of what I am trying to do is to push back on the idea that professionalization and careerism in the arts is something that should be valued at all. And I don't say this in a anti-intellectual or anti-professional way, but I say this in a way where I'm advocating and where I'm really emphatically saying that people can, for example, work a day job and produce art at night, and that's an entirely valid way of being an artist. Similarly, someone can be a stereotypical starving artist and pour everything into their art, and that's also entirely valid. So part of my attempt at reckoning with these concepts in this thesis is also opening up the definition of what it means to do art as a so-called professional, or to pursue art and as kind of something that becomes a bigger part of your life.
Haley, did you have a question?
Yes. Is this on? Is this working? Yeah? Wow, okay. I also have a question for Solomon. As somebody interested in the commodification of art myself, and somebody who went to Oberlin College in a previous life and spent all my time with conservatory students, I'm very interested in the specifics of how you undertook these compositions and improvisations with the agenda of creating music that was specifically not marketable. What kinds of processes did you work through yourself and with your interlocutors and collaborators to ensure that you were producing a kind of music that was rejecting marketability and commercial appeal? And what kinds of maybe canons of music and canons of music improvisation were you maybe working against? I'd also be interested in that.
Yeah, so I think, first off, I think maybe it is a bit of an oversimplification on my part to say that I am rejecting marketability or that I am somehow trying to push against the idea of popularity. I would love for my music to be popular. However, I think maybe to add some nuance to what I said in my presentation, I think I would say that I'm trying to deprioritize marketability and commercial viability in my work. And also, just to be self-aware, contemporary music is just about the least marketable type of music today. I mean, it's largely, back in the day, it was largely supported by patronage and by other forms of private support. These days, it's supported by the gig economy and by an ever-shrinking number of faculty and academic postings that are kind of like the last vestiges of private patronage clinging on. And so what I guess, and I've kind of gotten away from the question now, but what my process looked like was rather than centering, myself or my artistic vision as like the sole arbiter of the contents, I intentionally invited people into the process as collaborators. I performed on all of the compositions or conducted the compositions in that work, in that recital, but in fact, all but 2 of the compositions were collaboratively created in some way by intensive workshops with performers, by specifically incorporating improvisation in a way that gave agency to performers and myself alike in that live performance setting, and that would take a bit to get into, but I can explain it later if anyone is interested. And yeah, in terms of disciplinary or aesthetic influences, because I know you briefly touched on that, My improvisation practice is primarily influenced by folks such as Anthony Braxton, who I kind of borrowed the transidiomatic terminology from. I'm also very influenced by members of Atlanta's free improvisation community who come from all different musical trainings. And I have a bit of a developing kind of passive interest in the Fluxus School and in fields of performance art. So that's kind of where I'm coming from that perspective.
More questions? Yeah, go for it. Yeah, I've got a microphone coming to you.
I have a quick one for you, Ananya. I love your project. I really want to read those books now, although I'm scared because they sound terrifying. But your last line about just because you don't have institutional power, you are not powerless was obviously very moving and eloquent. But I was wondering if within your own process of research, and I guess working within an institution, with working within like the technologies of research as we have today, was there some way you found this to apply to yourself and the ways in which you either like felt powerless in institutions or felt like taking back a power to a certain degree?
Yeah, that's an interesting question and definitely something that I was thinking about because the questions that I'm looking at and the available material that I have to refer to, not all of it was super accessible, let's say, especially with what the library could make available to me. I'm thinking of just to get at the concept of domestication, I had to wrangle an article that the library, I thought they had it, they didn't have it, there was no way for me to access it. It wasn't even available online with a paid option. So to get it, and because I really wanted to get it, I did do some jugaad. I found the guy who is currently the editor. The internet has everything. His email address was on it. And I reached out to him. I said, I'm a student writing a thesis. Is it possible for you to send me a scanned copy of this one article that came out in 1998? I really need it. Please help me. And he did. It was a week. I emailed him on a Sunday, which, gasp, that's bad. But he checked it, and the very next day, he'd scanned it and sent it to me. And so I think for me, that's the closest I can get. But obviously, like you said, this is an institution that gives me quite a bit. And so what I'm writing is obviously from a place of privilege, which you can't really say the same for the characters in the texts that I'm looking at. And that's one of the reasons that I made this selection, in that the authors do a very good job of bringing together different contexts, but putting them into conversation with like that larger framework. So yeah, it's a good opportunity to reflect on my process. Thank you for the question.
Great. Do we have any more questions? As Carla's standing up, I think that means it's over. All right. Thanks, everyone.
I've got a couple of logistical things I want to say, but let me begin just a couple of concluding remarks by saying, first off, let's give all of our presenters a final round of applause. Really magnificent jobs. And as I said, reducing these complex and very detailed, very lengthy honors theses to 5 minutes and often one slide is really a tough feat. So I really applaud you. I'm also just incredibly moved by the range, the depth, the diversity, and the confluences that cut across many of your theses. You know, it was many months ago that I read your applications to admit you into this program. And one always hopes that there will be some synergies and some connections and ways of informing one another. And as I sat here, I just found myself incredibly moved by some of those connections. So I really applaud you, and I feel so gratified personally to having had you in this program. I also feel profoundly regretful that it was such a brief encounter with all of you. We only met 4 times. That's the stipulation of a 1-credit course. And it also further affirms in my own thinking how important I think it will be to make this a more extensive program, because I feel like I missed out on getting to know you better as individuals, getting to know your projects better, and having the privilege of working more closely with you. So I want to thank you personally. I know Shiv will echo my thanks to you for joining this program and giving us as much as you did. And again, I wish that we'd had more of you. I also want to just mention that even though this is just a 1-credit course, I really would be grateful if you would complete a course evaluation, not in any kind of self-interested way, but really to help us improve this program, because I know that there is room for us to develop this much more extensively. I don't think it'll move to a 3-credit course, so there's a kind of conundrum there in being not too burdensome for you, but giving you some introduction that transcends what you're getting from your honors advisor. The goal of the program, as Shiv and I kind of envisioned it, was both to help you move your honors thesis from draft or from some version of itself to completion, and you all did complete, and you all are earning honors, but also to immerse yourself somehow in the life of the humanities. And we had all kinds of ambitious goals of taking you to a play. Thanks to Haley, you got an immersive experience in the Carlos Museum, which I myself was blown away by. And I know all of the students who were able to attend that visit really developed a really much more meaningful relationship to this museum and its collection than we had. And I will say that as someone who has inhabited this campus for almost 30 years. I learned differently from you, so thanks to you, Haley. The goal was to immerse yourself in kind of the life of being a humanist and experiencing the humanities as something that we carry with us our whole life long. And I hope that you are graduating with an intense feeling of that, because it's not lost, I think, on any of us as we approach the next year's election. The Fox Center is going to be immersed in the life of democracy and in an interrogation of democracy as a concept, as an ideal, and as an institution that is very much under threat. I hope you feel like you have more and more of the tools to navigate your own futures, whether you're headed to graduate school, as many of you are, whether you're headed into the world of work, whether you're just going to take some time to travel and become even more informed citizens. Whatever your trajectories hold, I hope that you will feel like you have even more tools to navigate the mysteries, the wonders, the challenges. So thank you. And please join us for a reception. We've got lots of goodies back there. And hats off to you.